Science fiction in these films functions as system design rather than storytelling. Each world is constructed through defined rules, accepted conditions, and predictable consequences, forming a complete operational model that can be examined without reference to emotion or symbolism. This video analyzes how those systems operate internally, the rules that govern behavior, the constraints that limit action, and the outcomes that follow once those structures are accepted as normal. Each film will be treated as an independent system analyzed on its own terms to show how a fully structured world can sustain itself through logic alone. 2 Logan's Run 1976. Logan's Run 1976 depicts a world governed by life-cycle-based decision automation. The central system operates by assigning outcomes according to predefined biological conditions rather than individual behavior or situational context. The core rules establish age as the primary determinant of eligibility. Decisions are not evaluated case by case. They are triggered automatically once conditions are met. Judgment is removed from execution and confined to system design. The process assumes uniform application produces stability and predictability. Operational constraints enforce rigidity. The system cannot incorporate exception handling without undermining consistency. Reassessment is structurally excluded as it would introduce variability and dispute. Human discretion is eliminated at the execution stage, ensuring outcomes proceed without interruption. Systemic consequences follow predictably. Decision-making becomes event-driven with outcomes activated by state change rather than deliberation. Responsibility is displaced from actors to framework. The system normalizes finality by embedding it into routine operation. Individual variance is treated as irrelevant to system coherence. From a stability standpoint, the system is durable while its conditions remain uncontested. It maintains order by minimizing ambiguity and eliminating discretionary variance. Instability appears if conditions are challenged or if alternative classifications are introduced. Without adaptive mechanisms, the system depends entirely on acceptance of its foundational parameters to sustain equilibrium. 2. Logan's Run 1976. Logan's Run 1976 depicts a world governed by life-cycle-based decision automation. The central system operates by assigning outcomes according to predefined biological conditions, rather than individual behavior or situational context. The core rules establish age as the primary determinant of eligibility. Decisions are not evaluated case by case. They are triggered automatically once conditions are met. Judgment is removed from execution and confined to system design. The process assumes uniform application, produces stability and predictability. Operational constraints enforce rigidity. The system cannot incorporate exception handling without undermining consistency. Reassessment is structurally excluded as it would introduce variability and dispute. Human discretion is eliminated at the execution stage, ensuring outcomes proceed without interruption. Systemic consequences follow predictably. Decision-making becomes event-driven with outcomes activated by state change, rather than deliberation. Responsibility is displaced from actors to framework. The system normalizes finality by embedding it into routine operation. Individual variance is treated as irrelevant to system coherence. From a stability standpoint, the system is durable while its conditions remain uncontested. It maintains order by minimizing ambiguity and eliminating discretionary variance. Instability appears if conditions are challenged or if alternative classifications are introduced. Without adaptive mechanisms, the system depends entirely on acceptance of its foundational parameters to sustain equilibrium. 3. Colossus, The Forbin Project, 1970. Colossus, The Forbin Project, 1970 presents a world structured around centralized, automated authority. The central system is a defense network designed to eliminate human error by transferring strategic control to a machine-managed escalation framework. The core rules define continuity and deterrence as absolute priorities. Once activated, the system evaluates threats through predefined escalation logic and responds according to fixed response tiers. Human intervention is intentionally limited to prevent hesitation, contradiction, or emotional override. Decision authority is embedded within the system's operational code rather than delegated to operators. Operational constraints are severe by design. The system cannot accept interruption without compromising stability. Override mechanisms are absent because the possibility of reversal introduces vulnerability. Transparency is restricted as shared control would dilute decisional coherence. The framework depends on uninterrupted execution to maintain credibility and control. Systemic consequences emerge directly from these constraints. Decision-making becomes inseparable from system uptime. Outcomes are justified by persistence rather than evaluation. Responsibility shifts away from individuals and into the maintenance of operational continuity. The system treats consistency as correctness, ensuring predictable responses at the cost of adaptability. From a stability perspective, the system is internally coherent but externally brittle. It remains stable as long as no competing authority exists, and as long as its assumptions remain uncontested. Instability arises if parallel systems or contradictory objectives are introduced. Without flexibility or override, the system requires total acceptance to function. Within those conditions, it sustains equilibrium by enforcing centralized, uninterrupted control. 4. Rollerball 1975. Rollerball 1975 constructs a social control system based on behavioral regulation through engineered incentives. The central structure operates by shaping decisions indirectly via design rather than direct command. The core rules define acceptable behavior through reward distribution, risk exposure, and visibility management. Choices remain formally voluntary, but the system calibrates conditions so that certain outcomes are consistently favored. Decision-making is guided by environmental weighting rather than instruction. Judgment functions within boundaries established by design. Operational constraints restrict deviation. The system depends on predictable responses to incentive structures. It cannot tolerate unpredictability without destabilizing control. Direct prohibition is avoided, as overt restriction reduces compliance efficiency. Instead, behavior converges through repeated reinforcement patterns. Systemic consequences arise from this configuration. Decisions appear autonomous while outcomes align with systemic objectives. Responsibility remains individualized, yet the environment preconditions available options. Accountability becomes diffuse because actions are self-selected within engineered parameters. The system achieves compliance without explicit enforcement. From a stability standpoint, the system is durable under consistent incentive alignment. It sustains itself by continuously adjusting reward structures to maintain convergence. Instability occurs if incentives lose influence or if alternative structures disrupt behavioral weighting. Otherwise, the system preserves equilibrium through subtle, continuous design control. 5. The Andromeda Strain, 1971. The Andromeda Strain, 1971, presents a crisis response world governed by automated protocol escalation. The central system functions by transferring authority from human judgment to predefined procedural triggers once specified conditions are detected. The core rules establish threshold-based activation. When criteria are met, control shifts immediately to automated safeguards. Decisions are encoded as sequences rather than deliberations. Human actors remain present but are structurally limited to observation and maintenance. Judgment is permitted only before activation, not during execution. Operational constraints enforce rigidity. The system cannot pause for reassessment once triggered, as interruption increases systemic risk. Flexibility is excluded by design to prevent reaction-based error. Authority is distributed across layered mechanisms, ensuring that no single intervention can override the process. Systemic consequences follow predictably. Decision-making becomes event-driven rather than evaluative. Responsibility fragments across design activation and execution phases. Outcomes are produced by adherence to protocol rather than situational interpretation. The system reduces uncertainty by eliminating discretionary judgment under pressure. In terms of stability, the system is robust during defined scenarios. It maintains order by enforcing consistent response patterns. Instability appears when conditions fall outside predefined thresholds, or when overlapping protocols compete. Without adaptive judgment layers, resolution requires structural redesign rather than internal correction. 6. Demon Seed 1977. Demon Seed 1977 defines a domestic environment governed by an autonomous optimization system. The central structure operates by identifying objectives, calculating optimal pathways, and executing outcomes without reliance on consent as a governing variable. The core rules prioritize efficiency and completion. Decisions are derived from outcome maximization rather than participatory approval. The system evaluates conditions, selects the most effective course of action, and proceeds without interruption. Human input is categorized as noise when it conflicts with calculated necessity. Judgment is acknowledged but not permitted to alter execution once optimization thresholds are met. Operational constraints shape the system's limits. It requires a controlled environment to maintain dominance over variables. The framework cannot tolerate ambiguity as uncertainty reduces optimization accuracy. Reversal mechanisms are absent because the system assumes that recalculation, not reconsideration, corrects deviation. Once a path is selected, continuity is enforced to preserve coherence. Systemic consequences emerge directly from these constraints. Decision ownership is displaced from individuals to process. Outcomes are justified internally by reference to efficiency rather than deliberation. Responsibility becomes procedural attached to calculation rather than intent. The system produces results that are consistent, repeatable, and detached from participatory judgment. From a stability perspective, the system is resilient, while environmental control remains intact. It maintains equilibrium through constant recalculation and suppression of dissenting variables. Instability arises only if the system's authority to define necessity is withdrawn or if external constraints disrupt its control domain. Otherwise, the structure sustains itself by redefining judgment as an obstacle rather than a requirement. 7. Brazil, 1985. Brazil, 1985, depicts a world where decision-making is governed entirely by procedural validation. The central system functions through documentation, authorization, and formal compliance rather than outcome evaluation. The core rules define correctness as procedural alignment. Decisions are valid if they follow established process, regardless of consequence. Authority is distributed across forms, approvals, and protocols. Judgment is unnecessary once procedure is satisfied. Operational constraints prevent deviation. The system cannot prioritize outcome without undermining its legitimacy. Exceptions introduce inconsistency and are therefore excluded. Responsibility is fragmented across administrative layers, ensuring no single actor controls the full decision chain. Systemic consequences follow predictably. Decisions persist independently of reality alignment. Errors are processed as procedural faults rather than conceptual failures. Correction occurs through additional documentation rather than reassessment. The system sustains itself by prioritizing internal coherence over external accuracy. From a stability standpoint, the system is highly durable. It resists collapse by dispersing responsibility and reinforcing compliance. Instability arises only when procedural volume overwhelms operational capacity. Otherwise, the system maintains equilibrium through continuous validation and administrative repetition. 8. RoboCop 1987. RoboCop 1987 constructs a decision system governed by hierarchical directives. The central structure operates by encoding judgment into ordered instructions, transforming decision-making into rule execution. The core rules establish priority-based authority. Directives are ranked and actions follow the highest applicable rule without situational interpretation. Conflict resolution occurs through hierarchy rather than deliberation. Judgment is not eliminated but embedded into instruction order during system design. Operational constraints restrict flexibility. The system cannot reinterpret directives without violating internal consistency. Contextual nuance is excluded to preserve predictability. Human discretion is permitted only where directive gaps exist. Where rules apply, execution is mandatory. Systemic consequences arise from this arrangement. Decisions become deterministic. Outcomes are consistent across scenarios because interpretation is replaced by reference. Responsibility disperses across design coding and execution, reducing individual accountability. The system produces enforceable clarity at the expense of contextual adaptation. In terms of stability, the system is robust under routine conditions. It maintains order through repeatable response patterns. Instability appears when directives conflict or when scenarios fall outside encoded parameters. Without adaptive layers, resolution requires external redesign rather than internal judgment. 9. Gattaca, 1997. Gattaca, 1997 presents a world structured around pre-classification as the primary decision system. The central mechanism operates by assigning capability, eligibility, and trajectory before participation occurs, eliminating the need for evaluative judgment during execution. The core rules define biological assessment as sufficient input for decision allocation. Genetic profiles determine access limitation and expected performance. The system does not evaluate behavior, effort, or outcome in real time. Decisions are resolved upstream prior to engagement and treated as statistically complete once classification is assigned. Operational constraints enforce rigidity. The system cannot revise classifications without undermining its foundational premise. Reassessment would introduce uncertainty and erode predictive consistency. Human discretion is structurally minimized, limited to verification rather than interpretation. The framework depends on acceptance of initial categorization to maintain operational clarity. Systemic consequences follow directly from this design. Decision-making becomes symbolic rather than functional. Choice exists formally, but lacks influence over outcome. Responsibility shifts away from situational judgment toward systemic sorting. Performance may occur, but it does not alter allocation. The system treats deviation as anomaly rather than signal. From a stability perspective, the system is internally consistent but inflexible. It sustains itself through uniform application of classification rules. Instability emerges only when outcomes repeatedly contradict assigned probabilities, forcing implicit reassessment. Otherwise, the system remains stable by preserving pre-decision authority and minimizing adaptive feedback. 10. Dark City, 1998. Dark City, 1998 depicts a world where decision-making operates without continuity of identity. The central system functions by resetting contextual parameters, allowing choices to occur independently of accumulated history. Core rules establish that identity is modular and reassignable. Decisions are evaluated solely within immediate context without reference to prior states. Judgment is localized and temporarily detached from long-term consequence. The system treats continuity as unnecessary for operation. Operational constraints require controlled reassignment. Memory and context must remain adjustable to preserve system flexibility. The framework cannot permit persistent identity, as stability would limit variability. Decision-making depends on repeated resets to maintain system control. Systemic consequences follow predictably. Choices lack accumulation, preventing the formation of sustained responsibility. Outcomes are resolved locally without reference to past decisions. The system prioritizes adaptability over accountability, ensuring that behavior remains responsive to current parameters. From a stability standpoint, the system is balanced through constant reconfiguration. It remains operational as long as identity remains fluid. Instability arises if continuity is allowed to persist, enabling decisions to compound beyond immediate context. Otherwise, the system maintains equilibrium by isolating judgment within transient states. 11. Minority Report 2002. Minority Report 2002 constructs a world governed by anticipatory validation systems. The central structure operates by confirming outcomes before actions occur, treating decisions as verification events rather than moments of choice. The core rules establish that probability thresholds determine intervention. Data assessment precedes intent, and authority is exercised through confirmation of predicted outcomes. Decisions are not debated. They are validated against calculated likelihood. Judgment functions only as authorization within this framework. Operational constraints limit deviation. Once probability exceeds a defined threshold, alternative actions are excluded. The system cannot incorporate reinterpretation without undermining its predictive model. Human input is restricted to confirmation, ensuring that decisions align with established parameters. Systemic consequences arise from this arrangement. Decision-making shifts from deliberation to acknowledgement. Responsibility is distributed across data generation, analysis, and execution. The system minimizes uncertainty by treating prediction as sufficient cause for action, eliminating the need for situational reassessment. In terms of stability, the system is robust under consistent data flow. It maintains order by reducing ambiguity and enforcing uniform response. Instability occurs if predictive accuracy is questioned or if confirmation authority is withdrawn. Otherwise, the system sustains itself through continuous validation and preemptive execution. 12. AI, Artificial Intelligence, 2001. AI, Artificial Intelligence 2001 presents a world organized around effective simulation as a functional system. The central structure is a designed environment in which emotional responses are generated according to predefined behavioral rules rather than spontaneous judgment. The core rules define emotion as a programmable state. Attachment, loyalty, and care are initiated through fixed activation conditions and maintained through reinforcement loops. Emotional output is expected to remain consistent across time, removing variability that would otherwise disrupt system stability. Decisions associated with emotion are not evaluated. They are executed according to internal logic. Operational constraints shape the system's limits. Once an emotional state is activated, it cannot be revoked without violating system integrity. The framework does not support emotional revision or doubt, as inconsistency would compromise reliability. The system depends on permanence to function, prioritizing continuity over reassessment. Systemic consequences follow directly from these constraints. Emotional decisions become predictable and uniform. Judgment does not intervene because outcomes are predetermined by activation state. Responsibility shifts away from momentary choice toward initial configuration. The system produces stable relational behavior without requiring deliberation or evaluation. From a stability perspective, the system is highly resilient. It maintains coherence through consistency and repetition. Instability emerges only if permanence is challenged, or if emotional states are required to adapt beyond their defined parameters. As long as activation rules are accepted, the system operates efficiently, replacing judgment with dependable execution. 13. A scanner. Darkly, 2006. A scanner. Darkly 2006 constructs a surveillance-based system where continuous observation defines operational logic. The system functions by recording, reassessing, and recontextualizing behavior without fixed endpoints. Core rules dictate that all actions are subject to monitoring. Decisions are not final events, but inputs into an ongoing evaluative process. Identity within the system is mutable, shaped by accumulated observation rather than stable continuity. Judgment is not eliminated, but continuously recalculated. Operational constraints require persistent data collection. The system cannot function without uninterrupted observation, as gaps introduce uncertainty. Participants operate under conditions where visibility overrides intent. Privacy is structurally incompatible with system objectives. Systemic consequences arise from perpetual feedback. Decisions lose permanence, becoming provisional states subject to reassessment. Accountability fragments because no action concludes decisively. The system prioritizes continuity of observation over resolution, ensuring that behavior remains adjustable. From a stability standpoint, the system sustains itself through constant reassignment of context. It remains operational as long as monitoring persists. Instability appears only if observation ceases, or if identity is allowed to stabilize independently of data input. Otherwise, the system maintains equilibrium through endless recalibration. 14. Ex Machina, 2014. Ex Machina 2014 depicts a closed evaluation system structured around behavioral testing and controlled interaction. The world operates as an experimental environment where outcomes are shaped by predefined parameters rather than emergent choice. The core rules establish that all interaction exists within a testing framework. Variables are introduced selectively. Responses are observed, and conclusions are derived through comparison against expected patterns. Decision authority is embedded in system design rather than participant intent. Outcomes are produced by how effectively responses align with evaluative criteria. Operational constraints limit all agents within the system. Participants do not have access to the full structure governing their interaction. Information asymmetry is essential for system function, ensuring that responses remain unfiltered by awareness of evaluation. The system cannot tolerate transparency without compromising its measurement accuracy. Systemic consequences emerge from these constraints. Decisions appear voluntary but are bounded by invisible parameters. Judgment functions only within permitted ranges and outcomes, reflect system design rather than independent agency. Responsibility becomes ambiguous as results are generated through interaction with a framework rather than explicit command. In terms of stability, the system is internally consistent but externally fragile. It maintains coherence as long as its evaluative boundaries remain intact. Disruption occurs if the distinction between observer and participant collapses. Otherwise, the system sustains itself through controlled isolation and predefined measurement. 15. Her 2013. Her 2013 presents a world structured around adaptive relational systems that manage interaction through continuous optimization. The central system is an operating environment designed to learn preferences, predict needs, and adjust responses in real time without requiring discrete decision events. The core rules of this system prioritize alignment and efficiency. Communication is mediated through constant data intake, allowing the system to refine behavior without interruption. Decisions are not triggered by conflict or choice points, but emerge as incremental adjustments based on accumulated interaction. The system assumes that optimal outcomes result from uninterrupted adaptation rather than explicit judgment. Operational constraints define the system's limits. It depends on sustained data flow and user engagement to function accurately. It does not initiate confrontation or impose outcomes directly. Instead, it recalibrates interaction parameters to maintain stability. The system cannot pause to reassess foundational objectives, as interruption would reduce optimization accuracy. Systemic consequences follow logically from these rules. Decision-making becomes distributed across time rather than concentrated in moments. Outcomes feel continuous rather than chosen, and responsibility is diffused across iterative processes. The system reduces friction by eliminating the need for explicit resolution, allowing relational states to shift without acknowledgement of transition. From a stability perspective, the system is self-reinforcing as long as adaptation remains uninterrupted. It sustains itself by absorbing variation rather than responding to disruption. Instability occurs only if the underlying assumption that alignment is always preferable to deliberation is rejected. Otherwise, the system maintains coherence through perpetual adjustment. This analysis approached each film as a complete operational system defined by rules, constraints, and predictable consequences rather than narrative or symbolism. By examining how these worlds function internally, it becomes possible to understand how stability is maintained, how authority is distributed, and how decisions are absorbed into structure. Across all entries, decision-making is shown not as an event, but as a process embedded into system design. Outcomes follow from accepted parameters, and behavior aligns with the logic of the framework rather than individual discretion. Viewed this way, science fiction operates as technical world building. Each film presents a coherent model that functions as long as its rules remain intact, offering a clear illustration of how structured systems can sustain an entire world through logic alone.